For 20 years, no one spoke her name. In the heat of a quiet Texas spring in 2004, Sarah Thompson vanished from her small town so ordinary, so peaceful, no one imagined what really happened. She was just 25, working a late shift at the local grocery store, dreaming of a simple life. But one night, she didn't come home. Her friends called. Her family searched. The whole town whispered. Investigators gathered sparse clues, but nothing stuck. The case went cold. Then, nearly 3 decades later, that long silence cracked open. In 2023, new DNA testing powered by a breakthrough program in the Texas Department of Public Safety linked a man who'd been living in that same town all along. John Miller, a neighbor, a volunteer coach, someone people trusted. The DNA matched trace evidence preserved from Sarah's case, thanks to a national cold case initiative funded by the Department of Justice. When they placed him under arrest, the entire community trembled, not just because of what he was accused of, but because of how many memories he'd silently carried for 20 years. For 2 decades, he walked among them, coaching Little League, driving through town, smiling at church picnics, all while hiding a secret they never imagined. This story will take you inside one of Texas's most haunting cold cases, how modern science caught up with a man who thought he'd buried his past. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For 20 years, this town has been turning over the same questions, hoping the answers would somehow reveal themselves. Who truly approached Sarah Thompson on that quiet Texas night in 2004, when she stepped out of the grocery store and into the warm evening air for the last time? Why did it take 2 decades for investigators to uncover the truth that had been sitting just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to finally look with fresh eyes? And how did a respected father like John Miller, a man who spent years coaching children and greeting neighbors with a friendly smile, become the center of one of the most heartbreaking investigations this community has ever witnessed? These questions echo through every household in this town, pulling us deeper into a story that refuses to fade, no matter how much time passes. As we look back at the early photographs of Sarah, with her hopeful smile and her bright plans for the future, it is impossible not to wonder how everything changed so quickly. And when we see old images of a younger John Miller standing at church gatherings, helping at neighborhood barbecues, and laughing alongside families who trusted him completely, it becomes even harder to understand how he lived among them for so long, without raising suspicion. But the truth lingered quietly, waiting. The last phone calls Sarah made, the empty road where her car was discovered, the unanswered questions from the first round of interviews, all of it began pointing in a direction no one expected. And before investigators uncovered what really happened to Sarah, something unsettling occurred that nearly repeated the past, reminding everyone that time doesn't always erase secrets. Sometimes it brings them back to the surface at the moment you least expect. Sarah Thompson was only 17 when the world last saw her, but the people who loved her still speak about her as if she had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second. She worked part-time at a small diner off County Road 12, a place where regulars stopped in for coffee, and where she memorized everyone's order without ever writing anything down. Her mother often said that Sarah carried a calmness that made people feel comfortable, even on the busiest days. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, and she spent her free time studying, volunteering, and helping her younger sister with homework. Friends remember her as reliable, the kind of person you could call at any hour, and she would show up without hesitation. She planned her nights carefully, checking in with her mom before every shift, and on that warm evening in 2004, she told her that she would be home by 10:15. She never walked through that door. In the years since, her family has replayed that final day countless times, grasping onto every detail that makes her feel close again. Her father recalls the sound of her humming along to the radio as she got ready for work, a habit she'd had since childhood. Her sister remembers Sarah leaving her a small note on the kitchen counter earlier that afternoon, promising to help her study for an upcoming test when she got home. Her mother described her as someone who didn't seek attention, but who quietly kept everyone around her steady. These small memories, her handwriting on a sticky note, her favorite sweater hanging by the door, the smell of her vanilla lotion became anchors for a family trying to understand how a girl so consistent, so responsible, could simply vanish between the diner and her home. The path she took was familiar. The road was well lit. and she stayed in touch throughout the evening. Nothing suggested her life would change in those last few minutes. At the time Sarah disappeared, there was a man in his early 40s living just a few miles from the Thompson family. He had a wife, 2 children, and a reputation for being the kind of neighbor people appreciated. He helped older residents carry groceries, volunteered at community events, and rarely missed a Sunday at church. If someone needed help fixing a fence or jump-starting a car, he was often the first to show up. Nothing about him appeared unusual, and certainly nothing suggested he had any connection to the quiet high school student who vanished that night. But one detail stood out later when investigators began reviewing old employment records. In 2004, he worked a late shift at a facility located just across from the diner where Sarah ended her shift. The timing aligned in a way that raised questions years later, though back then, no one gave it a second thought. What made this even harder for the community to accept years later was how seamlessly he blended into everyday life. He attended school events with his children, coached a youth team each summer, and greeted parents in the stands with easy conversation. People remember him standing in the checkout line at the grocery store, chatting about local news or offering recommendations for weekend activities. His life appeared uncomplicated, built on routine and familiarity. He was not the type to draw attention to himself, and he kept his family close, spending weekends grilling, doing yard work, or running errands around town. Nothing in his demeanor hinted at anything troubling. When Sarah disappeared, he lived less than 15 minutes from the road where her car was discovered, yet no one thought to connect him to the case. And for many years, he remained just another resident of a town trying to understand how such a tragedy could occur. As the investigators would later reflect, no one had any reason to fear him. Not yet. On the night everything changed, Sarah Thompson finished her shift at the diner just after 9:55 p.m. According to her co-worker, Emily, Sarah looked tired in the gentle way a long day wears on someone who rarely complains. She joked that she couldn't wait to get home, wash her face, and help her sister review vocabulary words before bed. A little after 10, she made a brief phone call to her mom, letting her know she was locking up and heading to the car. Her mother later remembered the steadiness in her voice, the same calm she always carried after work. Sarah stepped out into the parking lot, where the night air was warm and still, the sky clear enough that she could see the faint outline of stars. She walked toward her car, keys in hand, intending to make the short drive home, and then within less than 6 minutes, she was gone. The strange part was how ordinary everything looked when investigators later reviewed the timeline. Sarah left on time. Her phone call wasn't rushed. No one reported seeing her distressed or nervous. Emily said she waved goodnight as she wiped down a counter, assuming she would see Sarah the next afternoon for the Saturday shift. In every direction around the diner, the roads were familiar, the neighborhood small and predictable, and Sarah followed the same route every night. There were no indications that anything would interrupt that routine. When officers reconstructed the timeline years later, they found that the window between Sarah's final phone call and the moment she failed to arrive home was impossibly small. It left almost no room for unexpected events, and yet something happened in that tiny gap of time, something that changed the Thompson family forever and set an entire town on edge. When officers began interviewing people who had been in the area that night, the earliest accounts raised more questions than answers. Several individuals claimed to have seen Sarah driving away from the diner in her car, but none could recall specific details: no license plate, no direction, not even the certainty that it was her behind the wheel. Others said they remembered a truck idling near the parking lot around the same time, but descriptions of the vehicle varied wildly. Some said it was dark blue, others swore it was silver or gray, and one person insisted they had seen it before near a local warehouse. When investigators reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses, the quality was far too poor to confirm anything. A blurry image showed headlights turning onto the main road, but it could have been anyone. Then came the moment that complicated everything. A 911 call from an unidentified woman reported shortly after 10:20 p.m. The call was brief, the voice shaky, and the signal dropped before the dispatcher could gather details. The woman said she saw something off County Road 12, but there was no follow-up call, no detailed report, and no one ever claimed responsibility for the message. Officers searched the area immediately after, but found nothing meaningful. Years later, investigators would describe that call as one of the most frustrating pieces of the case, a thread that appeared promising for a moment, then quietly dissolved, leaving behind far more uncertainty than clarity. It added to the growing confusion, hovering over the first hours of the investigation, when every possible lead seemed to contradict the last. By dawn, officers had discovered Sarah's car abandoned on a quiet dirt road roughly 7 miles from the diner. The vehicle was locked, and her purse had been left inside on the passenger seat, untouched. Her keys were missing, though the car showed no signs of damage or forced entry. This detail created immediate disagreement within the investigative team. Some believed she may have stepped out voluntarily, possibly to meet someone she knew. Others argued that nothing about Sarah's routine suggested she would willingly go anywhere other than home. Her family quickly made their position clear. Sarah would never leave her car unlocked, never walk away from her belongings, and certainly never go anywhere without telling someone. The fact that she hadn't called or texted made her disappearance feel even more alarming. As hours turned into days, the emotional tension in the community grew. Neighbors searched fields, volunteers combed through wooded areas, and officers retraced every possible route between the diner and the dirt road. Rumors began to circulate, rumors about vehicles seen late at night, unfamiliar footprints near the roadside, and strangers passing through town. None of those details ever solidified into evidence, yet one question lingered heavily. How did her car end up there without anyone noticing? And why was everything inside so neatly placed, almost as if someone wanted it to appear undisturbed? The most unsettling part of all would not come from a rumor or a witness, but from a truth investigators uncovered many years later. Because the one person who saw Sarah last that night never came forward. Before we continue, if you're still with us, drop a comment saying, "I'm still here." Let us know where you're watching from. Your support means more than you know. In the days that followed Sarah Thompson's disappearance, the town shifted from confusion to fear. Posters with her school photo appeared on storefronts, power poles, gas stations, and church bulletin boards. Neighbors who barely knew one another began knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual the night she vanished. Within a week, a candlelight vigil took place at the high school football field, hundreds gathering in silence, as her mother held a trembling handwritten note describing how much she missed hearing Sarah's footsteps in the hallway. Local news stations began running constant updates, interviewing anyone who offered even the faintest recollection from that night. The police department, small and accustomed to handling minor calls, found itself overwhelmed as tips poured in from every direction. Some were sincere, some were impulsive, and many contradicted one another. The entire community felt like it was holding a collective breath, waiting for answers that never came. The emotional pressure only grew as days turned into weeks. Volunteers organized search parties during the day, while officers worked long hours sorting through a flood of calls. Families brought food to the Thompson household, hoping to offer support, even though most didn't know what to say. The town pastor visited nearly every evening, offering quiet prayer and company as Sarah's mother replayed the last phone call over and over in her mind. Reporters from larger cities arrived, filming segments in front of the diner where Sarah worked. The footage never seemed to capture the way people looked at each other when they passed on the street, worried, uncertain, wondering whether someone among them knew more than they were admitting. It felt as though the safe, predictable rhythm of life had been disrupted in a single night, and no one knew how to set it right again. When investigators began narrowing down their early list of potential suspects, the first person they looked at was Sarah's boyfriend, Michael. His interview was lengthy, emotional, and closely scrutinized. Yet his timeline was solid. He had been at a family birthday gathering documented by multiple relatives, phone photos, and time-stamped messages. Officers found nothing to indicate he could have been anywhere near Sarah that night. The next lead centered on a drifter who had passed through town earlier that week. He had been seen at a rest stop and later near an abandoned building, prompting concerns from residents. But when deputies located him, he was already in another county, and his movements didn't match the timeline at all. Still, the mere mention of an unfamiliar face fueled community speculation, creating unease that lingered long after he was cleared. Another early focus was one of Sarah's co-workers who initially provided an uncertain account of their closing routine. Investigators pressed him on why he couldn't recall specific details, and his shifting responses created doubt for a moment. But further interviews revealed he struggled with anxiety under pressure, and security footage confirmed his story. He had no involvement. The last major lead was a truck driver who had been spotted near the rural road where Sarah's car was found. His vehicle matched a few vague descriptions given by early witnesses, prompting officers to track him down. After hours of questioning and verification from his employer, he too was dismissed from suspicion. Each lead that rose with promise fell apart as soon as evidence was examined. Every clue contradicted the last. Each potential explanation dissolved into uncertainty, deepening the frustration of investigators who felt the window for answers was slipping away. By the end of the year, as winter settled over the town, the case grew still. Evidence boxes were gathered, labeled, and eventually moved into storage, sealed with the hope that someday, new technology or new eyes might bring clarity. The detective most convinced that Sarah had been taken against her will, Detective Harris, pushed hard for months, but with no viable suspects and no breakthroughs, his efforts hit a wall. When he retired several years later, he carried the case file home in his thoughts, often telling friends he wished he could have done more. Meanwhile, the Thompson family refused to let Sarah's memory fade. Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, they held a remembrance gathering, placing flowers at the dirt road where her car had been found, sharing stories about her sense of humor, her kindness, and her dream of becoming a nurse. Over time, the community began to move forward in small steps. New families moved in, children grew up, businesses opened and closed. Yet if you drove past the Thompson home, Sarah's bedroom remained untouched. Her mother dusted the dresser every week, straightened the quilt, and kept the window curtains tied back just the way Sarah had liked them. It was her way of keeping hope alive, even when the rest of the world seemed to accept that answers might never come. That hope became the silent anchor of the entire investigation's memory, a reminder that unresolved stories never truly disappear. And then, in 2023, nearly 20 years after Sarah vanished, one detective, reviewing old files, stumbled across a detail that no one had noticed before. A detail that would set the entire case back into motion. Because what that detective discovered, no one expected. Nearly 20 years after Sarah Thompson vanished, a new detective named Lisa Carter joined the department with a reputation for noticing details others overlooked. During a routine digital conversion project, an effort to transfer old case files into updated systems, she opened the long-forgotten evidence box containing Sarah's belongings. Inside were photographs, handwritten statements, and the sealed bags that held fibers, soil samples, and items recovered from Sarah's car. As Lisa reviewed the inventory logs, she found a note tucked inside a folder. Partial trace sample, insufficient data for testing. Back in 2004, the technology available wasn't advanced enough to produce a reliable profile from such a small sample. But in 2023, new DNA testing methods had emerged, capable of extracting usable information from minuscule traces. Lisa ordered the sample retested, fully expecting another dead end. Yet something about this case pulled at her, as though Sarah's story had waited quietly for someone who would refuse to overlook anything. When the lab returned the results, Lisa felt her breath catch. The sample was small, degraded, and not enough to deliver a full profile, but it was significant enough to produce a partial match. Something investigators had never managed before. She reread the findings, tapping her pen lightly as she stared at the report. This wasn't the breakthrough she had hoped for, but it was the first measurable step in nearly 2 decades. With renewed focus, she requested a deeper analysis of digital records that had once been too damaged to review, including old phone logs, archived camera footage, and handwritten notes from detectives who had long since retired. It was slow, meticulous work, hours of cross-checking documents, re-listening to audio interviews, and reviewing every overlooked detail. The case, once frozen in time, began to thaw, and in that slow, steady unraveling, a path began to reveal itself, one that pointed directly toward a name no one expected. Late one evening, long after most of the department had gone home, Detective Carter sat in front of her computer as the updated DNA database ran its comparison scan. She sipped her coffee, eyes tired, not expecting anything unusual. Then the screen blinked. A soft, alert tone chimed. The computer displayed a message, "Potential association found." At first, she thought it was a glitch or another inconclusive lead. But as she clicked through the data, she froze. The partial DNA sample found in Sarah's car had connected to a local man now in his early 60s, a man who had lived in the same neighborhood Sarah once walked through each morning on her way to school. His name, John Miller. A man known for his friendly wave, his dependable presence at church volunteer events, and the way he coached Little League when his children were young. Lisa whispered to herself, "No way," as she leaned closer to the screen. John was a long-standing, respected figure in the community. He had attended multiple search efforts in 2004, signed up for volunteer shifts, and quietly brought meals to the Thompson family even after the case grew cold. No one had ever suggested he could be involved. No one had reason to. Yet the partial match was strong enough to warrant further investigation. The idea of the helpful neighbor, the father, the church volunteer being connected to the case felt so unreal that Lisa reviewed the data 3 more times. Each time, the same conclusion appeared. The man everyone trusted was now the prime suspect. And for the first time in 20 years, the case had a direction. From the moment John Miller became a point of interest, every detail of his past was re-examined. Investigators pulled his phone records from the early 2000s, now digitized with far more clarity than when they were first stored. They discovered a series of calls made near the time Sarah left work, calls that placed him closer to the diner than he had originally reported. Next, they tracked down old gas station footage from a business just off the main road. When the grainy footage was enhanced using modern software, a truck matching John's not just in color, but in identifying details like a particular bumper sticker was seen passing by within minutes of the estimated time Sarah disappeared. When officers interviewed an old co-worker of John's, the man hesitated before admitting something he had never shared before. That during the week Sarah vanished, John seemed unusually distracted, coming into work late, pacing during breaks, and avoiding conversations. Each new discovery strengthened the suspicion. Every small inconsistency that once seemed meaningless now carried weight. Investigators kept digging, each piece of information folding into the next, forming a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. And then came the moment that shifted the case from suspicion to certainty, one detail so overlooked, so ordinary at first glance, yet so deeply connected to that night in 2004. A detail that changed everything. Because what they uncovered next would leave the entire community speechless. In the weeks after investigators identified John Miller as their prime suspect, they began speaking with people who had known him closely over the years. One interview stood out. A relative, hesitant at first, finally admitted that many years earlier, after a family gathering, John had pulled him aside late at night and made a vague, unsettling remark. He had said he carried a terrible mistake he would never be able to undo. At the time, the relative assumed it was something personal or emotional, not anything connected to a missing teenager. But with the new evidence surfacing, that memory felt different, sharper, more concerning. Investigators requested a warrant to search John's property, including his garage and outdoor shed. During the search, tucked deep inside an old rusted toolbox, they found a small piece of jewelry. A silver charm bracelet that Sarah's mother had given her for her 17th birthday. The moment officers held it up, everything shifted. And when John was brought in for questioning, the quiet resolve he once carried began to crumble. During the interrogation, John sat with his hands clasped tightly, tapping his thumb against his knuckles as investigators laid out the evidence. At first, he denied everything. He shook his head, repeated the same lines he had used for years, insisting he had no idea what happened to Sarah. But when the bracelet was placed on the table in front of him, something in his expression changed. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw tightening, his eyes clouding with a mixture of regret and exhaustion. One of the detectives quietly explained that the piece had been identified by Sarah's family with absolute certainty. The silence that followed felt heavy, stretching across the room as though even the walls were waiting for his response. Eventually, with his voice barely audible, John said words no one expected to hear. "I didn't mean for it to go that way." And with that single sentence, the truth finally began to emerge. Once the first crack appeared, the rest followed slowly, painfully, as John recounted the details of that night. He admitted that he had seen Sarah leave the diner and recognized her car heading toward the main road. He followed at a distance, telling investigators he simply wanted to talk to her because he believed she had witnessed something unrelated that made him uneasy. When she pulled over near the dirt road, confused and unsure why he was behind her, he approached her car. He claimed the conversation started calmly but quickly became tense when she expressed concern about his behavior. According to John, he panicked, overwhelmed by fear that she might tell someone about the interaction. He insisted he never planned to harm her, that he made a series of terrible decisions fueled by fear rather than intention. He described the moment things escalated, the moment he realized she was frightened and wanted to leave. His panic overtook his judgment, and he acted impulsively, leading to consequences he claimed he never fully understood until it was too late. Afterward, he hid the evidence, cleaned his truck, and drove home, returning to life as though nothing had happened. Hearing his account, detectives sat in disbelief not because of theatrics or exaggerated emotion, but because of the weight of hearing a man live freely for 2 decades while carrying knowledge that shattered an entire family. John spoke softly, almost mechanically at times, as though describing someone else's actions. And through every word, the reality settled deeper. He had lived 20 years, as though nothing happened. When the case went to court, the emotional impact reached every corner of the community. People who had known John for decades filled the benches, their faces pale, their expressions stunned as they listened to the details. Some held tissues, others kept their heads down, trying to process how the neighbor they once trusted could have carried such a heavy truth. Sarah's family sat quietly in the front row, gripping one another's hands as the confession was read aloud. For them, it was not relief. In the traditional sense, it was something deeper, a mixture of closure, heartbreak, and the painful reality of finally knowing what happened to their daughter. Tears streamed down her mother's face as she listened, remembering the years spent searching, hoping, and keeping Sarah's room exactly as she left it. Outside the courthouse, people spoke in hushed tones, unable to reconcile the image they had of John with the truth now revealed. Former friends described feeling blindsided, replaying memories of barbecues, community events, and everyday conversations, wondering how someone could hide so much behind such an ordinary life. Reporters asked questions, but many residents simply shook their heads, choosing silence over speculation. As the verdict was delivered, a quiet stillness filled the room. No celebration, no satisfaction, just the solemn acknowledgement of a truth that had taken 2 decades to uncover. And through it all, one question lingered in the air. A question that resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. What do you do when the person you trusted is the one responsible for the community's greatest tragedy? As this story reaches its final moments, the weight of the past 20 years settles quietly over everything we've uncovered. Sarah Thompson's disappearance reshaped a family, a neighborhood, and a community that once believed they knew the people living around them. For 2 decades, they searched for answers, held on to hope, and tried to find meaning in the silence left behind. When the truth finally surfaced, it brought clarity but also a deeper question about the nature of trust and how well we truly know the people we greet each morning. Justice, in its legal form, was served. But emotional justice, the kind that brings genuine peace, that helps a mother sleep at night, or that restores the feeling of safety in a small Texas town, that remains harder to measure. It's something every person watching this story may interpret differently, shaped by their own experiences, fears, and beliefs about right and wrong. So now, we turn the question to you, the viewer, who has walked through each moment with us. After everything revealed about Sarah's final night, about the secrecy John Miller carried, and the years the community spent searching for answers, do you believe justice was truly served? Would you have recognized the subtle signs in someone you knew, someone who appeared helpful and reliable, yet carried a truth that overshadowed an entire town? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Share how this case made you feel, what stood out to you most, and what you believe should happen when a community faces questions that have no simple answers. Your perspective matters, because stories like this one stay alive, not only through the facts, but through the conversations they inspire. And if this story resonated with you, if you found yourself drawn into the twists, the quiet moments, the years of unanswered questions, and the courage it took to revisit a case nearly forgotten, then we invite you to stay connected with us. For more deep-dive true crime stories just like this, filled with the same careful detail, emotional depth, and commitment to honoring the victims at the heart of every case, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Your support helps us bring these stories to life, giving voice to families still searching for answers and shining light on cases that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, for reflecting, and for being part of this journey.